The painting The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein, when looked at closely, is able to tell us not only about the two men in the picture, but also what was going on in the world that these two men were living in, the world of the Renaissance. Now, it's not easy to exactly define the Renaissance because, as our syllabus says, there were many cultural forces conflicting with each other, while also happening simultaneously and overlapping with each other as well. Our anthology, however, defines the Renaissance as an extraordinary cultural and intellectual movement, involving a rebirth of letters and arts stimulated by the recovery of texts and artifacts from classical antiquity, the development of techniques such as linear perspective, and the creation of powerful new aesthetic practices based on classical models. Now, looking at the painting The Ambassadors closely, one can see that there are a lot of tools and instruments that were being used during the Renaissance period. First, let's start by looking at the top half of the table. The tools present are a celestial globe, portable brass sundial, table quadrant, an astronomical instrument, a simple quadrant, a polyhedral sundial, and a sundial used for finding the position of celestial bodies. Now, what do these tools seem to represent about the Renaissance? For the most part, these instruments and tools are used in looking at the sky and up into space, most likely by folks attempting to study the universe or other celestial bodies. These tools were used by academics, scientists, and nobles alike to study space, and through that study, the idea of divine cosmology came about. Divine cosmology is the idea that God, through his unfaltering love for humanity, created the earth and along with it, humans. This idea of divine cosmology influenced the works of many different writers at this time, including poets George Herbert and John Donne. Through these new ideas about God and his creation, a new way of thinking called humanism came into play. George Herbert. Herbert was one author interested in the cosmological aspects of the world. His poem, The Pulley, emphasizes the love God had for humanity when creating Earth, and how that love should be returned to him through humanity's weariness. Lines 18 through 20 of The Pulley read, "Let him be rich and weary, that at least if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast." These final lines of The Pulley are looking at the cosmological ideas of the time, observing that God created humanity with love and beauty, wisdom and pleasure, but not rest, so that humanity, when tired and weary, will turn to God and recognize him as their Savior. The emphasis this poem places on God's love for humanity is an aspect of divine cosmology, and within the Ambassadors, the celestial tools are representative of reflection on this divine love. John Donne was another writer during this period, most famous for his metaphysical poetry and writings. In his poem, I'm a Little World Made Cunningly, he discusses the destruction of God's creation, Earth, by man, and begs God for forgiveness and to turn him, the speaker, towards God. Donne says that he is a world made of elements and an angelic sprite, in line 2, but goes on to describe the destruction of that world in lines 3 and 4, where he writes, "But black sin hath betrayed to endless night my world's both parts, and oh, both parts must die." For the remainder of the poem, Donne asks God to destroy the world that lust and envy have burnt, and to restore him through his body and house. Looking at this poem cosmologically, Donne recognizes that the world he is has been created by God, citing how angelic it was originally. Over time, though, this world has deteriorated due to man, and the lust and envy man has brought to earth. Donne recognizes that God's love is the only way to restore this creation, and calls upon God for help in this restorative process. Now let's look at the geography of the Renaissance and how this literature affected that. So during the Renaissance, there was a boom in exploration and discovery of new worlds. All across Europe, monarchs were sending explorers on voyages to new places inhabited with people that they had never seen before. Combining both the top and bottom parts of the table in The Ambassadors, we are able to see some tools that were useful in these exploratory endeavors. The celestial globe, sundial, and torquetum from the top half of the table, combined with the terrestrial globe and compasses from the bottom half of the table, give viewers tools that may have been used in overseas travel and on other expeditions. John Donne writes satirically about these exploratory adventures in Elegy 19 to his mistress going to bed, and we viewed these explorations firsthand while watching the movie Cabeza de Vaca. In this elegy, Donne equates discovery of the New World to sexual discovery with his mistress. He writes, "Oh, my America, my newfound land, my kingdom, safeliest when with one man manned, my mine of precious stones, my empery, how blessed I am in discovering thee." Now these lines exemplify the influence that discovery and exploration had on the writers of this time. Donne, using these popular ideas, was able to comment on society's desire for exploration in new worlds through comparing this exploration to sexual activity and exploration with his mistress. Now, Cabeza de Vaca was a film about an explorer who went to the New World, and it chronicles his adventures there. Now, watching this film and reading excerpts from the book affords one the opportunity to see the New World from the eyes of a Spanish explorer turned slave. Upon arriving near what is now Tampa Bay, he underwent many misadventures, ending up in Texas, and of the 600 men that went along on this expedition, only 4 survived. Cabeza de Vaca saw it as his duty to enlighten the savage people of the New World as well. The Ambassadors takes this idea into account by putting a hymnal book among these exploratory tools. Now, what is so important about the geographic literature this time is that it signified the advancement of the human race. Within the Ambassadors, viewers can see the tools that explorers used to travel to these new lands, and the literature this time reflects that want of exploration and discovery. Also present is an open hymnal book. During this time, there were many explorers that thought it their mission to enlighten savages with the word of Christ, and this book is representative of that. Now, the Renaissance was a period of time marked with very significant scientific discoveries as well. The Ambassadors serves as a reminder that the position of man is central within creation. This painting shows that man apprehends the physical world and the realm of pure intelligence through his senses and intellect. Man's reason plays a role in these two faculties as an intermediary force. Now, Galileo, known as the father of modern science, was a very prevalent figure during this time period. In Dava Sobel's book, Galileo's Daughter, Galileo's lifelong struggle with the Catholic Church is documented, as well as many of his inventions and advancements to astronomy, mathematics, and physics. What connects Galileo to the Ambassadors is the fact that he made advancements in astronomy that were profound and are still very relevant today. This is represented in the astronomical tools on the top half of the table. In 1609, he discovered 4 of Jupiter's largest moons and published his findings in his book, The Starry Messenger. These findings, among with many others, helped to confirm Copernicus's heliocentric model of the universe, which said that the sun was the center of the universe instead of the earth. One of the most influential and provocative things that Galileo wrote was called Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernican. In 1633, Galileo stood trial facing heresy charges for this book. The Holy Office of Inquisition prohibited his book because it claimed that Copernicus's model of the universe was the correct one, and this was out of accordance with what the Catholic Church declared true. Jonathan Sawday was a writer who wrote a chapter entitled The Rhetoric of Self-Discussion, and in this chapter he looks at the spectacle of human dissection during the Renaissance. He writes, "Anatomy is shown to be a science which seems to animate the body and endow it with a life of its own so that it could assist in the engaging spectacle of its own division." Further into the chapter, Sawday writes anatomy was simply a shared fate of all bodies. These two observations show 2 different things. First, that the advancements in science taking place were enormous. Such in-depth study of the human body was very powerful, not only scientifically, but also spiritually and philosophically as well. This observation leads into the second observation, which describes the advancement of philosophy in human life. Through this dissection, people began to see that humans were A, very advanced and complex beings, and B, that death was a very powerful thing and is a very powerful thing. No matter who you were, what you were doing, death always claimed you. What this led people to focus on more and more was what happened to them after death. In the ambassadors, the balance between senses and intellect can be seen with the separation of the tools. This separation is what was necessary for the flourishing ideas of the Renaissance. It showed that man had a unique and special part to play in both the scientific realms of the celestial as well as the terrestrial. Theology is a very important topic during the Renaissance. This is represented in the ambassadors. The man on the right side of the painting is named George de Selve, and he was a well-known scholar and clergyman. The man on the left was a French aristocrat named Jean de Dintiville. Their mission was to travel to England and try to convince Henry VIII not to separate from the church. George de Selve's presence in the painting is representative of the curiosity and boom in new knowledge of the church and new theologies. A half-hidden object is also present in the painting, and if one looks closely at the top left part of the painting, a crucifix can be seen behind the green curtain. While the table between these two men is meant to represent the numerous symbols of human advancement in scientific knowledge, the crucifix is there to remind people that while all of these things are good, the end goal of life is salvation. This may also be there to remind us that human knowledge is just a speck of dust in comparison to God's omniscience. The presence of these two theological reminders in the painting serves to show interest with theology during the Renaissance. Authors like John Foxe, George Herbert, and artwork like The Ecstasy of St. Teresa are some examples of embodiment of the theological ideas of this time period. From Foxe's enormously popular book, Acts and Monuments, which chronicles the stories of hundreds of martyrs, is the chapter The Death of Anne Askew. This account recalls a death that Anne suffered because she was wrongly accused of heresy. Foxe writes, "When all things were thus prepared to the fire, the king's letters of pardon were brought, whereby to offer her safeguard of her life if she would recant, which she would neither receive, neither vouchsafe once to look upon." This account details the events leading up to Anne's execution. What Anne was found guilty of was disagreeing with the idea of transubstantiation that the Roman Catholic Church held as completely true. This is the idea that the communion was literally the body and blood of Christ, that the Catholic Church believed this. What Anne thought was that the bread and wine were merely representations of Christ's love, and she cited biblical references saying that God turned himself into a door, into a vine, and Anne also believed that this representation of God was present within the communion. What is important about Anne's death is that it is completely unjustified. When she was questioned, she was able to catch her accusers in their own accusations and mix them up. She was released numerous times before eventually being burned at the stake. The Catholic Church at this time held absolute power over citizens and was even able to burn them for disagreeing with their ideas. Moving on, let's look at George Herbert's poem Redemption. This poem deals with Christ's death within the landlord-tenant analogy, comparing the speaker of the poem to an unsatisfied tenant appealing to his landlord for cheaper rent. The poem deals with Christ's death on the cross, as well as the lack of understanding that humanity has in light of Christ's true goals. Herbert writes, "Of thieves and murderers there I espied, there I him espied, who straight your suit is granted, said and died." Within these lines, Herbert is pointing out the death of Christ on the cross. His death took place between two thieves, as shown in these lines. What is important to note about this poem is that the tenant went on a search for Christ in heaven and places on earth that he thought were good enough for such a great landlord. This poem is so important because it recognizes the theological ideas of this time. People were turning away from God and looking for him in places that humanity deemed fit. As with Anne Askew, what the church said went, regardless of it being correct or not. In many cases, it seems that the Catholic Church was making poor decisions. This poem points out that we will find Christ right where he belongs, among the thieves and murderers. Or looking at the sculpture, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa